So the next thing I want to talk about is another kind of law and crime issue. I want to talk about fines specifically and why fines are problematic. And I'm not just going to talk about crimes committed by individuals. I'm also going to talk about crimes for corporations or nations or other such organizations that engage in criminal behavior. Okay. So the first issue with a fine is that it revolves around money. Okay, Ben, this is the most obvious thing in the world. Hold your horses. So if you are given a fine, regardless of what the fine is, when you go to pay it, it is going to take away from your ability to do other things with that money. If you have a low income, then, so I'll give you an example. In the city, in Philadelphia, where I live, there is a fine for illegal parking. It's $26. Okay, doesn't sound like a ton of money, but if you're living paycheck to paycheck and any little emergency or any little expense could hurt your ability to feed yourself or keep a roof over your head, $26 could be a ton of money. But if you're doing really well, or you're rich, or you work in an industry where you're paid a lot of money, $26 might be nothing. Essentially, what happens here is that because the fines don't scale with income, fining becomes a regressive tax, which is to say, crimes that are punishable by fines only really affect the poor. This type of classism, and this is in addition to the class war that I always talk about, this type of classism really hurts people and makes it so that certain crimes can be committed more or less with wanton and abandon by individuals who have more money. Now, I use the parking as an example, but think of other types of crimes, larceny and others and other such crimes, money laundering, things like that. If there is only a fine for whatever the crime happens to be, then what's it to a rich person? I just pay the fine and move on with their life. And if there's no chance they can ever be punished further, then there's no real disincentive to stop committing the crime. For a poor person who parks illegally, $26 might be a huge incentive to never park illegally again, or to be really careful about when you park, to make sure that you've got your meter full, or you're parking free parking, or you're not outside the parking, or whatever it's going to be, right? But to a rich person, parking illegally, $26 is pocket change. It means nothing to them. Okay, you pay the fine, who cares? It doesn't bother them at all. And because it doesn't bother them at all, there's no disincentive to commit the crime again, and again, and again, and over again, until some other level of punishment kicks in. So that kind of makes sense, right? Now, many of our crimes are punishable by jail time. And while I think there certainly are issues with the carceral state, it is true, at least for the most part, that going to prison is a deterrent for crime, which is to say that people who understand, that are thinking rationally and understand that the risk of something is losing their liberty, may choose not to commit that crime. Now, that's not to say that every criminal acts rationally or anything like that. But what it is to say is, in theory, now I know this doesn't happen in the US, but in theory, a rich person and a poor person can go to jail, and that deprives them of the same type of liberty, right? It hurts them in the same kinds of ways. They can lose their job, they can lose their home, they can lose their familial connections. They lose years or months or however long off their life, right? They get something they can't get back. They lose something they can't get back, I'm sorry. And in that sense, that seems like a more just punishment, and it seems that it might have the same deterrent effect for people who are rich and who are poor. Abolitionists, don't at me. This isn't about abolition. This is just about the differences between fining and incarceration in general, regardless of the issues that we all have with the carceral state and how incarceration has been used to perpetuate race and class war. Okay, just putting that aside. Okay, don't at me. So if you think about the conversation we just had with concerning how fines only really affect the poor, Well, that also translates to an organizational context. So if you're an organization, say Wells Fargo, and you spend your time making fake accounts for your customers in order to get them to, in order to make it look like you're doing more business so that you can do, you can get bigger bonuses or you make the company look better or what have you, the company makes money off of those practices. And there are lots of other practices, illegal practices that companies make lots of money on. If you're a large company and you only get fined for your participation in the crime, then it seems as if there is no real disincentive for you to stop doing the bad thing. In theory, you could essentially decide that a fine is just a cost of doing business. So for example, if you're a company that makes $1 billion perpetuating a fraud, but the government only fines you a couple $1 million or like $200,000 or something less than the amount of money you made, then if you run a cost-benefit analysis, it makes sense to perpetuate the fraud again because you made more money than you lost and the company paid it. You as an executive or someone who could in theory be accountable or fix it didn't suffer any consequences. You didn't lose any money. You didn't go to jail. You didn't have any consequences perpetuated on you. In fact, nothing happened to you, right? I mean, maybe you lose your reputation a little bit, but whoop-de-doo. There are two solutions to this problem that may be deterrents for frauds reported by all levels of organizations. Now, of course, if you're a tiny organization and you make a lot of money on a fraud and you're fined that amount of money, or you're fined less than that, it still may hurt you a lot. But as your company gets larger and you have more capital, and by that I mean money, to move around and expend in things, then you may see fines as a cost of doing business. Just like in some countries, bribery is a cost of doing business, even though it's wrong. So essentially, you get to the point where you need a solution that stops corporations, especially large corporations, from engaging in these frauds that they make tons of money on. And in my opinion, there are two solutions here. Again, abolitionists, I apologize, don't at me. The first one is to incarcerate or otherwise directly punish individuals who are at the top of these organizations who have what is called, in the legal world, management control. So what management control means is essentially an individual in a company that can help shape the direction of a company. This is typically your C-level people, CEOs, CFOs, COOs, and things like that. Sometimes it's the board of directors who will outline to whom the CEO is typically held accountable in a public company. If those people go to jail or are threatened with the possibility of going to jail or probation or whatever it's going to be, it's entirely possible that they think twice before effectuating the scam, regardless of how much money it's going to make them. The other thing that you can do is that you can make these scams more costly to run than they are beneficial. So what this essentially means is, if we go back to our $1 billion example earlier, if you're a company that runs a $1 billion fraud and you're charged $2 billion or $3 billion or even more than that, or even just $1.1 billion, when you do the calculation, it becomes very obvious that it is less profitable to commit the fraud than it is to just do business as usual. Because no matter how much money you made off the fraud, it seems that the government is going to charge you more. And the government has a couple ways of doing this. One, they can simply just fine you whatever number is slightly larger than the amount of money you made, or they can require you to do what's called restitution, plus a fine. Restitution is the legal concept where you give back to those whom you've harmed. So imagine if a corporation steals $100,000 from some individuals. So what they're going to end up doing is, if the law catches them and says, "Hey, you stole $100,000 from individuals, we're going to punish you," the government has the first option the government has is just to say, "Well, we're going to charge you $110,000 for your crime," and then the state gets all of the money that was made during the fraud plus a little extra to shift that balance of fraud or no fraud in the no fraud direction. But the other thing you can do, which is in my opinion, exacts more justice is to say, well, actually, the fine for what you did is not going to be that large. However, you have to give back all the money that you stole. You have to give back all the profits that you made off of this fraud. So if you stole $100,000, you have to give the $100,000 back to the people that you stole it from. And on top of that, we're also going to add a fine. And it could be a small fine. It doesn't have to be a large fine. But at that point, no matter which route you take, however you exact justice, you end up in a situation where the fraud is harder to perpetuate in pure financial terms, because the balance has shifted from fraud is profitable to fraud is not profitable. So again, I don't want this segment to be a banner for incarceration, to say that jailing people is good and that there's nothing wrong with the carceral system, and worse, the carceral state. There are so many issues with it, and I highly recommend that you spend some time to look them up. I've certainly talked about them on this show. I'm sure I will continue to talk about them on this show, but this segment is specifically about, does it make sense to use fines, monetary penalties, as punishments for crimes? And I think on the individual level, it almost never makes sense, because any crime for which a fine is the only penalty, it is essentially a crime that is only enforced against poor people, that only deters poor people, that the rich can get away with committing. On an organizational level, though, I think the question is slightly different. I think actually fines can be a good way of causing companies to rethink their actions. But the point is, the cost of the crime, the cost of the punishment has to be higher than the reward gained. Whether you do it in restorative justice means, by requiring restitution on top of the penalty, or just making the penalty larger than the crime, regardless of how you do it, you can shift the balance of rational acting that the corporation or organization makes from fraud is profitable to fraud is not profitable. And in theory, you can reduce the amount of frauds that happen. So hopefully this has been a good primer on the issues with fining as a punishment, and I hope you will start to look at the way that society treats fines and treats certain crimes, and educate yourself a little bit about why it doesn't make sense to use fines necessarily as punishment for